Today we're going to be looking at 10 signs that your guitar needs a little bit of love. Hey, welcome back all my YouTube friends. Thank you for tuning in. Today's video is going to be talking about the guitar and some signs that your guitar might be in need of a little tune-up. So we all know by now that the guitar is not just a hunk of wood with some parts thrown together. It's actually a well-calibrated system, and for the system to work properly, some of the tolerances have to be dead on. Even just a couple of millimeters of difference within some of the specs for a guitar is enough to throw it out of whack. So how do you know if your guitar is in need of a tune-up? Well, there's a few key things, and today's video is going to be talking about these things, and we'll go through them one at a time. So the number one issue, which is a very common issue, and I hear about it all the time, is when people say that their tuning is not stable. In other words, the strings, once they're in tune, go sharp or flat very easily. And so a lot of people assume that the issue lies here in the tuners, and that sometimes is true. That can be the case when you have some bad tuners installed on your guitar. So that's maybe the first place you'd want to look. But in actual fact, from my experience, the issues with tuning on a guitar often lie right here at the nut. If the nut is improperly installed, improperly shaped, or the slots for the strings are cut too low or too high, it could throw the tuning stability of your guitar out of whack. So what you will want to do is you want to verify that the nut is cut properly for your guitar type and that it has been adjusted so that your strings don't bind up whenever you're trying to tune your guitar or bending a note. So if you're bending a note and you see that it goes, all of a sudden when you're strumming a chord, it's out of tune again, most likely it's because the nut isn't properly cut. So what you want to make sure also is that your strings are the correct size for the slots cut in the nut. And this is something that is often overlooked, because sometimes you will buy a guitar and you decide that you want to bring your strings up a gauge or maybe bring it down a gauge, and you forget that the nut has been adjusted for a certain thickness of strings. So if you're going up a gauge or maybe even 2 gauges on your strings, what's going to happen is your strings are going to be very, very tight in the slots, and it's going to bind up, and the string simply won't slide through the slot whenever there's tension put on the strings, and they'll basically go out of tune. So that's number one. Number two is frets that are worn. So after you have a guitar for a while and you've been playing it, and often we're playing the guitar in certain positions more than others, you will start to notice that right under your strings, at the frets, you will start getting little divots that will start appearing. And this is very normal wear and tear on a guitar. But what ends up happening is when you start having these divots, you start having buzzing noises that appear when you're playing guitar. So often when you've had a guitar for a long time and the frets start to wear out, you will have this issue, especially if your action on your guitar is very low. Also, when the frets get worn, they become very low, and again, that often causes buzzing in the strings. So if you're hearing buzzing when you're playing your guitar and you don't know why that's happening, one of the culprits can be wear on your frets. Number three, while we're on the topic of frets, often when you buy a new guitar, you'll notice that when you're bending a string, especially the higher strings, so either your G, B, or E string, when you bend your notes, sometimes you will feel under your fingers when you're bending that note some scratchiness happening at the frets. And the reason for that is that often whenever you buy a guitar, and this normally happens more often on lower end guitars, the manufacturers will not necessarily spend enough time finalizing the guitar and polishing the frets the way they're supposed to be. So they will sometimes level the frets, and when they do the leveling, they don't go as far as they should, and what ends up happening is that there's microscopic scratches left in your frets, and you will feel them and hear them when you're bending the strings. And if you feel some kind of scratchiness under your strings, that means that it's time for a fret polish. So just like it's very common to see guitar strings that go out of tune when you have a bad nut, it's also very common to get buzzing on the guitar. And buzzing can be caused by a variety of different things. So whenever there's buzzing, when you're playing your guitar normally, and you're not strumming too hard, and you hear buzzing on your strings, usually it's caused by a high or low fret. And that could be a result of what we just said earlier, of worn-in frets that basically need to be replaced. Or it could be an improper leveling on a new guitar where they haven't taken the time to level all the frets out. So one of the frets is high or low and basically causing the string to hit one of the frets and cause the buzzing sound. So that could be one of the reasons. The other thing is a fret that can actually be a little bit high because it's not seated properly. Sometimes frets can pop out of the grooves that were cut when they were installed. And when that happens and the fret lifts off a little bit, it's also a good reason for some buzzing when you're playing your guitar. So that's something else you want to watch out for. So if the frets have been leveled and crowned properly and polished properly, then the buzzing might be somewhere else in the guitar. Number 5. So as we mentioned, if everything is okay with your frets, everything's leveled properly and that's not the issue, but you still have buzzing, well, there's some other places that you could be looking for this problem to happen. One of the areas is right here at the bridge. So if your bridge and your saddles that are holding your strings are adjusted too low, basically the same thing will happen when you're hitting a fret. When you're pressing down your strings, what will happen is that the strings will once again touch the top of the frets and cause buzzing. So you want to make sure that your bridge is adjusted properly at the proper height for the action on your guitar. Especially if you tend to be a very hard strummer, then your action might need to be a little bit higher, which means that your bridge saddles will have to be a little bit further from the top of the frets. All right, then if that's not the case, well then the next place to look at is the action of the neck. So the neck on a guitar is made in such a way that it can be adjusted either downwards or upwards when you adjust the truss rod. This is often at the top of your neck or at the very bottom. In this case, it's right here underneath the truss rod cover. So if the neck is perfectly flat, in some cases, when you're strumming a string, the vibrations of the string will vibrate far enough to start hitting the top of the fret. So that's why you need to give your guitar a little relief, which means a little bit of a bow, so that when the string vibrates, it clears the strings. So if that hasn't been adjusted properly on your guitar, once again, your strings will hit the top of the frets and you will get buzzing. So that's something that is very common. It's an easy thing to fix, but it's still one of the areas that you have to look at if you have buzzing issues on your guitar. So the next topic brings us to the electronics part of the guitar equation, and that is also something that is very important, because if the electronics are not working properly on your guitar, you will have issues. So when you start hearing scratchy pots on your guitar, when you're turning the volume knob or hitting the switch, and you might hear some like type noises, and when you hit the switch, maybe your bridge pickup works fine, but when you go out to engage the neck pickup, maybe you don't hear it right away. Maybe you have to shake the little switch a couple of times before it actually works properly. Well, these are all signs of issues that are happening here in the electronics. Now, a lot of times these are caused by oxidation. If you have your guitar for a long time, after a while, the electronics might get a thin, oxidized coating on it, which basically stops it from working properly. This can always be cleaned out with a little bit of a special electronics cleaner. It's not a big deal, but it's a good idea to get in there from time to time and make sure that everything is clean and there is no oxidation happening. And that could also happen right here at the output jack when you put it in, and sometimes you might hear some weird scratchy noises, or maybe it will cut out from time to time. Sometimes what ends up happening is that the solder joints that are made when you're making the connections between your pickups to the pots, to the switches, and to the jack, what ends up happening is one of those little solder joints was not well done, or maybe it was a cold joint. And a cold joint means that the solder hasn't melted properly at a high enough temperature to make a good melted solder joint. And that often will break. And when it does, something will happen. You might lose the ability to control the volume or the tone or maybe the switch. So these are all signs of electronic issues that you can have with your guitar. They're not major problems, they can all be fixed, but it's a good idea to know where to look if you have any of these issues. The next sign that your guitar might need a little TLC is when you start playing your guitar and you start feeling some edges protruding at the fretboard, especially the ends of your frets. If you find that playing your guitar has suddenly become uncomfortable and you're noticing some scratches on your hands or just some jagged feeling frets, well, that could be that your fret ends have not been properly adjusted from the factory when you bought your guitar. They maybe haven't spent enough time working the edges of the frets so that they're flush with the edge of the wood. And if that's the case, they need to be taken down, filed down, or sanded down so that they no longer cause that problem. Now, if you've had your guitar for a while, it's not a brand new guitar, and you haven't noticed this issue before, and suddenly this becomes a problem, it could be that the environment where you're storing your guitar in has changed for some reason. For example, if you're suddenly storing your guitar in a drier environment, or maybe the seasons have changed, all of a sudden the heating kicks in and things have become drier, or maybe more humid during the summertime, well, wood is very prone to absorbing and shedding water. And when it absorbs water, it expands. If the wood of your guitar is basically absorbing water from the environment, it's going to expand and basically become a little bit larger. And if it's drying out, it's going to contract. Now, if it contracts, the frets on your guitar are metal. They don't contract, and they're going to start protruding beyond the edges of your fretboard, and that's going to be a problem. So if you start seeing this issue happening with your guitar, check the environment that you're storing in. Maybe you want to invest in a humidifier or a room that's more balanced and a little bit more guitar friendly. So number 8 is a problem that we don't want to have because it's a little bit more of a serious issue, and that is when your neck is warped. So when your neck is warped, it basically means that the neck is no longer flat and has shifted to one side or another along the fretboard. And that is a little bit harder to address and a little bit more expensive to fix. So hopefully you won't have this issue. This often happens whenever a guitar has a neck where the wood has not been dried properly, maybe used before it's completely dry or hasn't been kiln dried, and also where the grain of the wood is not perpendicular to the neck direction, which happens more than you think. How can you check if your neck is warped? Well, you can try sighting down the neck by looking from the nut side all the way to the bridge. Sighting down the neck, you will often be able to see if the neck is warped like that. If it's too subtle, you might not be able to see it with the naked eye, in which case you're better off taking it to a luthier that could evaluate the situation and tell you what the best steps would be to resolve the issue. Sometimes if the neck is only slightly warped, it can be fixed just by doing a compensation when you're doing the fret leveling, but other times you have to actually take out the frets, plane the neck so it's perfectly flat, and then put on new frets, which is very time consuming and very expensive. Number 9, you'll notice this issue on your pickups. If your pickups have suddenly become microphonic, then there could be an issue with the potting of the pickups. How do you know if your pickups are microphonic? Well, number 1 is that if you take your guitar and physically turn up the volume and talk into your pickups, you can actually hear your voice coming through the amplifier. That means that the coils are vibrating and causing the pickups to actually work as if they were microphones. And so what normally causes that issue? Well, if your pickups were originally waxed potted from the company, and all of a sudden your pickups have become microphonic, it could be that the wax potting has deteriorated over time with heat and temperature. All right. So what ends up happening is that basically the wax that basically holds everything together, the coils of your pickups so that they don't vibrate, have deteriorated, and now your coils are vibrating and causing your pickups to be more microphonic. If your pickups were never wax potted, then obviously that could be the issue, which means that you can take your pickups out and wax pot them to make that issue go away. You'll also notice less feedback if your pickups are wax potted. Number 10. So the last thing on our list is intonation, and that is basically the adjustment of the bridge and the saddles on your guitar. And the reason why you want your guitar to be intonated properly is so that when you're hitting a chord, everything rings out properly and you don't have funny overtones that sound sharp or flat. And so how do you get your guitar to be intonated? Well, basically you need to look at your bridge, and the bridge saddles on your bridge have to be adjusted in such a way that when you're strumming your open string and it's in tune, and then you're fretting your 12th fret, that it's also hitting the same note and is not necessarily sharp or flat in comparison to the open note. If it is sharp or flat, it has to be adjusted, and the way you do that is you would either bring your saddles on that particular string either front, forward, or backwards to compensate so that everything is basically intonated the way it should be. Now, if your guitar is intonated and all of a sudden you find that the chords sound funny when you're strumming them, why would that happen all of a sudden? Well, you might want to think back and look to see whether or not you've changed your strings. And when you've changed your strings on the guitar, maybe you decided to go up a gauge or down a gauge. Well, the microscopic difference between let's say a 9 gauge string or a 10 gauge string is enough to throw the intonation out of whack. Often people forget when they change their strings that they have to look at the intonation once again, especially if they've changed the gauge of strings that they're working with on the guitar. You never want to change your guitar strings and not readjust the intonation, the relief of the neck, and also look at the slots of your nut to make sure that they're cut wide enough to accommodate the bigger or smaller string gauges that you decided to use. So I hope this top 10 list of things to look out for on your guitar has made it a lot clearer for you and made you realize what the issues can be and where to look to be able to resolve the problems. Most of the time when you keep your guitar in good working order, it becomes a pleasure to play and you can have a lifetime of enjoyment from your instrument. It's only when we neglect our instruments that things start falling apart and then require a lot more invasive work to get them back to where they should be. So if you take care of your instruments and make sure that you work on them regularly to keep them happy and healthy, you will also be happy to play your guitar for a lot longer. If you like the information that we're presenting right here on Addicted to Gear, please consider subscribing. If you haven't already, hit the little bell icon. You can hit the little bell icon to be notified whenever I put some new content on my channel just for you. In the meantime, guys, thank you for tuning in. Stay tuned, keep rocking. There'll be more great videos coming your way right here on Addicted to Gear.